If here you are in Missouri, I guess what is your message to the people here in Missouri while you're here?
Well, of course, I'm speaking at a Republican Lincoln Day dinner. The NRA is not a Republican organization, but a huge percentage of Republicans do support the positions we take in terms of the Constitution and the Second Amendment. So I'm happy to be here. But you know, the strength of the NRA and the strength of those who believe in the Second Amendment stems from the fact that it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats and independents and the like. Here in Missouri, Governor Nixon is a strong gun rights person, as Senator Blunt and a lot of the congressmen from this state. So this is not a partisan position, but we feel very strongly that those who believe in Second Amendment rights are under real fire today, as is obvious to everyone. The President, Dianne Feinstein of California, and the Mayor of New York are anxious to really restrict firearms rights. Hunters, collectors, those who use firearms for self-defense are under fire, and our job is to make sure that they don't succeed, and we hope that we're going to be able to do that.
Okay. And how can you accomplish this? I mean, it's almost, is it a battle you can win?
Well, it's a battle we are winning. I should say it's a war we're winning. In a war, you lose some battles. In New York, we have a governor in basically a one-party state who rammed through a package of gun control laws that nobody had a chance to read, nobody had a chance to debate, there were no public hearings, and when it was over and the smoke cleared, 80% of the law enforcement officers in the state realized that they'd been made felons by the law that the governor had just forced through, so they're now going back trying to change it. In Congress, there have been a whole group of proposals from a number of people who want to restrict firearms rights, and many of those proposals are stalling. They're stalling for two reasons. First of all, it's bad policy. It's a bad way to operate, to make policy in the wake of emotional kinds of things such as the Newtown tragedy. It was our feeling that as people began to look at the proposals and to really consider them, and once the emotion went away to some extent, we weren't nearly in as much danger of having them pass as they were if they could be rammed through in the first few days. And secondly, frankly, members of Congress and the Senate are hearing from their constituencies and from their constituents, from the voters who pay their checks, pay their salaries. And the early narrative that the president had, of course, was that the NRA doesn't matter anymore, that everybody wants these things, that reasonable Americans want all of the things he wants. He's discovered that that narrative doesn't work because thousands and thousands of people have been contacting Congress and contacting their senators saying, we don't want these things. We don't want bad policy. We don't want these burdens on us. We don't want law-abiding Americans punished for the activities of a few criminals and a few people that are insane. Instead of going after our firearms, why don't you look at the real problems? Why don't you provide security for our students on the one hand, and why don't you look at the mental health system that's totally broken down in this country? You know, there are over 1,000 homicides a year that are estimated to be committed by people who 10 or 15 years ago wouldn't be on the street. But now they are on the street, and the result is that they're the ones who both do individual homicides and are almost invariably the kinds of people who, if they can get their hands on a gun, will get into a school or a shopping center or the like and try and take a lot of people out.
Let's talk about what's going on in Colorado and how that's affecting the rest of the country.
Yeah, Colorado is an interesting case study because Colorado is not New York. In fact, I was out there to meet with Governor Hickenlooper before the votes were taken in the legislature there, and I told him, I said, you know, the press has been asking me why I'm meeting with you, and I told him it's because you're not Andrew Cuomo. And he said, I appreciate that. But the fact is that in the last two elections, Colorado at the legislative level has flipped over and has a liberal majority. And they passed these laws, and the governor signed some of them because he's got to live with it too, and he's a Democratic governor. Right now, what's happening in response to that is really threefold. One, those companies in Colorado that are firearms companies have announced they're leaving the state. Secondly, a major competition that brings hundreds of competitors to Colorado to shoot each year has announced this week that they're leaving the state and they're going to be somewhere else. And thirdly, a number of the legislators, in fact, the legislators that made up that majority, are facing recall elections. So the people of Colorado are not amused by what this liberal majority did out there. we're participating in those recall campaigns on the one hand, and we're doing in Colorado, or are going to do in Colorado, what we're already doing in New York. Many of these proposals are basically unconstitutional. We're already in court in New York. We'll be in court in Colorado trying to get some of these things struck down. And if that doesn't work, and if it takes a few years, we'll go at it until the rights of the Colorado gun owners are reestablished.
Have you heard anything about this insurance?
Right.
That just happened today, didn't it?
Well, there have been a number of these kinds of proposals. They proposed this out in Colorado. They proposed it elsewhere. What it really amounts to is a fee to own a gun, and a little bit like a poll tax to vote. And in Maryland, for example, the governor has a whole bunch of fees that he proposed that would add $200 or $300 to the cost of a firearm if you purchased it. Well, my own view of that is that that's unconstitutional, because it is legitimate to put reasonable restrictions on one's Second Amendment rights, just as you can on First Amendment rights. But you can't make those rights so burdensome that average people can't exercise them. And if you're talking about average people, adding $200 or $300 or forcing them to buy insurance that makes no sense is simply adding a financial burden to their desire to exercise a fundamental constitutional right. And I don't think that sort of thing would stand up in court if it could ever get through a legislature.
And let's switch gears and talk about ammunition restrictions right now, too. How concerned are you about those?
Well, we're concerned about it. You know, from 1968 until the mid-1980s in this country, the people who sold ammunition had to keep a register. In those days, ammunition disappeared from the shelves of hardware stores and the like because it was just too burdensome, so you had to go to major dealers to get it. Finally, the federal government itself said, stop this. We don't want this, because this is a commodity. You can't trace it. It doesn't make any difference. We're piling up tons and tons of paper. We've got bureaucrats going through it. It doesn't make any difference one way or the other, and it's foolishness. That's what they're really doing. This is one of these things that I call feel-good legislation. They said, well, let's register them. You know, in Connecticut this week, they passed legislation that would require anybody who buys ammunition at any time, any new time, to get a background check and be fingerprinted, so that every time you went to buy a box of shotgun shells at the hardware store, which wouldn't do it anymore, but say at Walmart, you'd have to go through another background check. That's ridiculous. As is this limit on how much you can have. You know, people will say, well, you don't need more than 100 rounds. You know, if you're competing, for example, if you're an Olympic level competition, those who are involved in skeet and trap competition shoot 1,000 rounds a day in practice. Now, to you and me, that sounds a little weird. But if you're going to be a world-class shooter, that's what you're going to do. So should we restrict them to buying 100 rounds, or what should we do? The fact is that these kinds of arbitrary limits are nothing more than feel-good limits that have no impact on anything, wouldn't prevent one crime, wouldn't prevent one mass shooting, are not the answer to any of our problems, and are simply a burden on legitimate Americans. You
mentioned regular Americans and skeeters. This also affects our law enforcement, too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, law enforcement has to train. You know, in New York, we got into this. This is the argument over high-capacity magazines. The AR-15, which is the best-selling long gun in the United States and has been for some years, comes with a 30-round magazine. And so the president and others said, well, we shouldn't have 30-round magazines. Why don't we have 10-round magazines? And then some others said, well, why not 15 rounds? Instead of 10, that's a compromise between 10 and 30. And then Andrew Cuomo said, well, you know, I can top that. We'll pass a law up here that restricts you to 7-round magazines. And it turned out that 80% of the sidearms in New York, mostly carried by the police, have more than 7 rounds in their magazine, and therefore are illegal. And they didn't grandfather anything. They didn't have an exemption for law enforcement, so that virtually every law enforcement officer in New York became a potential felon. So these laws get to be ridiculous. Chuck Schumer, the sort of what sounds like the most reasonable proposal is what they call universal background checks. Although now they're calling it near universal background checks, because even the president says we shouldn't have background checks when a father wants to sell his gun to his kids, although Chuck Schumer thinks we should. And it gets a lot of popular support when somebody says to someone on the street, do you think there should be a background check universally if someone wants to buy a gun, and they say, sure, that sounds sensible. The Schumer proposal, to give you a concrete example of what it includes, it doesn't just include the purchase of a firearm, but what they call transfers of a firearm. An example, my daughter is in the Army Reserve. She served 2 tours in Iraq, 1 tour in Afghanistan. She owns 1 firearm, an AR-15, that she likes to take to the range and practice. If she were activated and sent off to Afghanistan or wherever we have our problems, and she put that firearm in the hands of her sister or me or anyone else to keep because she couldn't take it with, she would be a felon, and so would the person who had custody of that gun. If she took her sister to the range while she was practicing and let her fire that firearm, she'd become a felon. And that's the kind of thing that we find in these laws when we start to look past the title. They always say the devil's in the details, and in these kinds of things, there is real deviltry down in the details.